Well, today, what we're going to do is we're going to be taking a look at some of the content that's actually covered in chapter 1 of the book, which is actually named the same title as the book, The Good and Beautiful Life. And if you've not had a chance to read this, I wouldn't worry about it. It's an introductory thing. You can go back and catch up on that reading later. But I think the ideas we're going to share today will really kind of help you out. And here's the big thought for the big idea of the whole chapter is this, is that all of us desire happiness. Everyone's looking for a way to have a happy and a good life. But here's the thing, not all the narratives that we encounter lead us to happiness. You see, we encounter different narratives in life, but the narratives of Jesus, the story that Jesus tells, the way he puts life together is the guide to the good and the beautiful life. You see, last fall, we started talking about the stories we tell ourselves about God. And the stories we tell ourselves about God are foundational. If we don't believe who God is and understand who he is, and that's why we spent so much time talking about how Jesus reveals the true nature of who God is. Those are such foundational beliefs. But sometimes as believers, we get this idea, okay, I understand that Jesus died for my sins. I know that Jesus is God's son, that God is our Father. You know, and I believe in Jesus' sacrificing death and his resurrection. So, okay, I've got those beliefs right. But then once we have those beliefs set, sometimes as Christians, we kind of move on and then ask the question, what am I supposed to believe about my life? And we try and construct our own stories. And we try and figure out how to create the good life. In the good life, we end up being on this quest for happiness. And we have to be careful because sometimes we can have the wrong idea as to what leads to happiness. It kind of reminds me if you have like little kids and you're to try and give them a menu. It's like, hey, kids, what are you going to eat that makes you happy? And the hand goes up. It's like, I'd like to eat 2 liters of ice cream for lunch, please. And any kid who you'd see eating 2 liters of ice cream for lunch, any parent or any adult would look at that and say, that might sound like it'll lead to happiness, but that will not lead to happiness. That'll lead to sickness and an upset tummy. And honestly, even most little kids know 2 liters of ice cream is going to be too much. But here's the thing. We might look at a young child who says, I just want to have ice cream for lunch. That's how I can be happy. And they start eating and eating and eating and looking at where they're going, that's going to make them upset and not bring them the happiness or the joy or the nutrition they need. The reality is sometimes we buy into similar false stories or false ideas of what we think will bring us happiness. The false narrative that we encounter inside of this chapter. And what this book actually does is it comes and it tells us how are we going to embrace the narratives of Jesus. But the false narrative we encounter is that the stories or the narratives or the ways of this world are the way to find happiness. This is what the entire advertising industry is based upon. The whole advertising industry is based upon trying to give you a story to make you believe that something will lead you closer to happiness. And they use different ways to do it. They might tell you beauty. If you are beautiful, this is what makes you happy. So they encourage people to, buy makeup and buy these things, or if not purchase those things, they try and put beautiful people next to things to tell you if you own this object, you will look sexy or have sexual appeal or look attractive to the people around you. And we think attractiveness makes us happy, or possessions make us more attractive, which lead us to material happiness. Or maybe it's something as simple as this. A Big Mac will make you happy. If you've had a Big Mac, I'm just going to tell you, they taste good for a bit, but they're not that satisfying. Can we be honest? Or maybe there's other stories that aren't just even based in the advertising industry, like the bigger stories, is that your desires are what is ultimately important, and your quest should be to try and fulfill your desires. Or maybe it's this. Someone tells you, you only live once, so do everything you can. That's what success is, if you do everything you can. Or look out for number 1. We could go on, and there's different narratives that we encounter, narratives that we're told from our parents, narratives that we're told from people around us, narratives that we're taught by culture. But in the end, if we chase these as the cornerstone of our lives, We can end up disappointed, creating idols to worship instead of God and ending up being trapped by what those idols would do with us. And ultimately, if we chase any idol, anything other than the true God, we end up bound in sin. One of the most amazing parts of the chapter, and I like sharing sometimes a highlight that really spoke to me, is the picture that James Bryant Smith talks about when saying why sin is not all it's cracked up to be. And he says it here on page 23, and I'm actually going to read a couple paragraphs because I thought they were so thoughtfully and well done. The heading begins this: sin is ugly, virtue beautiful. Sin has many defenders and no defense. Sin is ugly. It is the opposite of beauty. When I see a man leering at a woman, it makes me cringe. Anger can be ugly. When I see someone become enraged, it is unsightly. Worry is unbecoming, and judging others is repulsive. When I hear someone say terrible things about another, I feel ill. Pride and prejudice, deception, degradation, all are ugly. When I see these in others, it is clearly unattractive. But when I see them in myself, I'm quick to rationalize and minimize them. Despite its ugliness and destructiveness, sin still manages to lure us into its illusion of happiness. In contrast, virtue, not the outward appearance, but the inner reality of heart that loves goodness, is beautiful. When I see someone tell the truth, though it hurts them, it is lovely. When a man treats a woman not as an object, but as a person, I see beauty. A person who does a good deed in secrecy is a marvel and a wonder. Sin is always ugly, and genuine virtue is always beautiful. Sin leads to ruin, virtue to greater strength. And this is why everyone, even atheists, love Jesus. Jesus was pure virtue. He lived a good and beautiful life, which he's calling his apprentices to live. I remember the first time I read that passage, and I just stopped to think, and I said, it is so true. Sin. And sometimes we protect and guard our sin, but when we see sin in others or in our world around us, it is ugly. It isn't beautiful. But then we look at the lives of the people that we admire, that we'd most want to be look like, and it is the virtue that God has placed in their hearts that makes them shine. Here's the thing. If we're going to find a roadmap by which to live our lives, it needs to be an accurate map. If I was out in the wilderness, lost in the mountains, I don't know if you call them mountains, the hills of New Brunswick, trying to find my way through the woods, and I had a map. If the map was inaccurate and didn't have hills where they belonged, didn't have streams where they were meant to be, I could look at that map and walk around as much as I would want to throughout the wilderness, even if I had a compass, and I wouldn't be able to find my way, because if the map isn't accurate with the topography of where you are, it is not a useful map. And here's the thing, all of us carry around internal maps in our minds and in our hearts that tell us how the world should be, how the world should live, how to find happiness, how to find what is good and what is right, and how to find purpose in our lives. But the problem is, many times the maps we carry in our hearts and in our minds and the maps that we give to other people are just not accurate. They're full of these false narratives and stories that other people and the world and the patterns of this age have set inside of us. So the question becomes, how do we have an accurate map? Would we rather choose to keep using the map we've created for ourselves or the map that someone else has given us? Or would we rather try and embrace the map that Jesus presents to us? Here's the thing I've grown to realize. I don't know anybody who's tried to live out of Jesus' map that hasn't put his practices into place and found them to be false. I don't think anyone's found them to be false. But often our own stories lead us into regret. This whole course, this whole study, this whole book, and the time we're going to spend together is going to ask the question, how can we live our lives founded upon the teaching of Jesus, specifically found in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 through 7. In this great message, Jesus comes up and gives his magnum opus, his great speech, his great talk about what it is we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to live and what his kingdom looks like. And inside of this, we're going to find that Jesus says certain things. He says, this is the way you're supposed to handle forgiveness. This is the way you're supposed to handle lust. And I think sometimes we get the wrong picture as to what Jesus is up to. Sometimes we think Jesus is trying to say, if you don't live your life this way, I'm not going to bless you. If you don't live your life this way, I'm not going to do good to you. But the reality is Jesus is one who reveals who God is. The one who reveals the nature of God is also revealing the nature of our world. And the reality is, there is no blessing and life apart from living in the way that he has designed things to be. C.S. Lewis said it this way. He said, God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from himself because it is not there. There is no such thing. When we live our life inside of the ways that God has called us to live, the way that Jesus establishes, we experience peace and hope and life and joy and blessing and contentedness. Many times when people are thinking about whether or not they want to choose to follow Jesus Christ and to choose to follow his ways, the question that might come up is this: what will I have to give up to follow God? What will I miss out on if I choose to follow his ways? Will I miss out on the partying and fun? Maybe I'm just going to be a boring old fuddy-duddy who doesn't do anything interesting. Well, here's the thing I just want to put out there. Maybe we're asking the question wrong. What do you give up if you choose not to follow Jesus' ways? The reality is, if we choose to pursue the narratives and the stories and the patterns of success that the world would set in front of us, we miss out on a greater sense of contentment and joy and peace and hope and life. We miss out on God's blessings that he has ordained for us. And I'm just going to tell you something from my own personal experience. The people I know that have surrendered their life to Jesus and chosen to follow him, they're the furthest thing from the boring people I've gotten to know. Many of them are the most adventurous people, the bravest people, the most courageous people, the greatest world-changing people that I've ever met. So the question I want to give to you today is this: are you interested in embracing the life that Jesus offers to you? If you read chapter 1 this week, or whenever you do, James tells a story about a man named Ben. That he would go to visit when he was a chaplain one summer at a nursing home. And this man named Ben was 75 years old. And by every other standard imaginable, he was successful. He had accumulated wealth. He had had influence. He had had position. He had had opportunities. But as he sat in that nursing home at age 75, because of his actions, he alienated himself from his family. He didn't have relationships with people. He had manipulated others. He kind of looked at his life and said, although I have money, more money than I can spend, I see my life as a failure. And what really becomes probably the most heartfelt part of this chapter is at the end, is that at age 75, along with James, this man made a decision to say, I'm going to turn my life to Jesus. Maybe it's not too late. And at the very end of the chapter, we read about how for the next 13 years of his life, till he was 88, his life was transformed. How he began to have the peace and the joy and the love and the life that he'd struggled to find for 75 years, and even reconciling with some of his family. I will tell you that story today to say this: it's not too late for God to do a great work in your life. All of us need to see God do transforming work in our life. The spiritual practice that went along with this week's chapter was to sit down and write a letter to God. And some of you may have done that even walking into New Year's. Just write a letter saying, God, the life I most want for myself is, and writing a letter, and just a letter which is like a prayer to God, saying, God, this is what I'd like my life to look like. As I sat down over New Year's to do this, I thought it was just in a very appropriate time in January or the first part of the year to write down and say, God, what should my life look like? I was struck when I wrote my letter as to how the things that mattered most were not material things, not achievements, but they were the relationships and the areas in my heart and my life that I felt God wanted to work on and change and make beautiful inside of me. But I also realized I needed God's help to change. So I encourage you, the whole purpose of this study is not just to read another book. It's not just to underline a few things. It's not just to have ideas. The whole purpose of this is to believe that as we put Jesus' teaching and his way inside of our hearts and ask for the Holy Spirit's help, that we can be transformed. And no matter where you are in life, whether you're 12, 52, or 82, God can continue to work in you and give you a good and beautiful life. Amen? God bless you. But with every week's chapter, there's a corresponding spiritual practice. Now, we've been doing some of these with our previous book that you could experience later, but these spiritual practices sometimes are things like prayer or fasting, or things you might be more familiar with, but sometimes they're things that are a little different. And that's what this week's one is like. At the end of chapter 2, you might want to skip ahead so you can kind of plan on this, but this week's spiritual practice is play. Now, I know some of you might be looking at me and saying, Chad, is that really a spiritual discipline or practice that I need to try? But I really encourage you. And you may wonder, what does play have to do with God? But here's the thing. When Jesus in his teaching talked about what was required of us to enter the kingdom of heaven, Jesus said this. He says, the one who wants to enter the kingdom of heaven must become like a child. And by being a child doesn't mean we need to become childish, but a child has a degree of carefreeness, a lack of taking themselves seriously, and a freedom that is kind of vital to their being able to embrace and trust and put their trust in their parents. And as children of God, sometimes we can get so focused on work and busyness that we lose track of the ability to enjoy the world that God has given to us. I read an article online this week that said this: play forces us to loosen our grip on our ambitions and our worries. It is a call to trust. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how it becomes very easy in our part of the world to always be looking for metrics and measurables in life. I have an Apple Watch. It's got a crack in it because I sat on it the other day. But when I do my exercising or when I go out for a walk, I'm always curious, how many steps did I have? How many calories did I burn? And it's always kind of measuring everything I'm doing. And, there's nothing wrong with having goals and trying to do healthy things, and I'm all for that. Or maybe you've got a Fitbit. Some of my kids have one. Heidi's got one. Those are all great things. But sometimes we can get so focused on the metrics that we forget to enjoy our surroundings. Maybe it's time to take off the metrics or to put the calendar to the side and just do something that you enjoy. If you've got children or grandchildren that you're able to be with at this time, maybe get down on their level and play their game and just enjoy them. Maybe get a movie that's a good movie that's just funny and laugh with a bowl of popcorn. Maybe find a hobby you've had that you've enjoyed for years, but you've just found yourself too busy or preoccupied to get into. There are different ideas inside of the book, but here's the big thought, is that part of being a child of God is being able to enjoy the good things he's given to us. We just read it in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, if you as a parent, or if parents know how to give good things to their children, even if they're broken and evil and corrupted, as all of us are in ways, how much more will a Heavenly Father give us good things to enjoy? Let's enjoy the goodness of what God has given us in his creation. So take a look at that. Take a break from work. And after you've played, maybe take some notes. Make a note. Say, how did that go? How did I feel when I was playing? Maybe you found it really hard to stop. Maybe write about that. What is it that's driving you that makes it hard for you to be able to stop and enjoy the things that God has given you opportunity just to enjoy? So that's our spiritual practice for the week. So before we go, I just want to remind you, you should read chapter 2 of the book. If you do not have a copy of the book, if you visit our website, ssc.church, you can go to the announcements page. You'll see a link with a picture of this book, The Good and Beautiful Life, on it. And there we've actually got a scanned copy of chapter 2 to hold you over until you get your book this week. So you can read that. So read chapter 2 of the book. Plan on practicing the spiritual practice of play, and plan on being back here next week. We'll plan on having our video up on Sunday night because I don't expect us to be out of Orange before then. And I look forward to seeing you then. God bless. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to have you. And I'm trusting that God's going to do great things in your life this winter as we study this book together.